Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today with you all. As mentioned, my name is Mitra and I'm an archivist at the Muslims in Canada Archives, which I'll probably refer to throughout this presentation as MiCA. I put together a whole presentation that I'm going to try to not take up too much time and make space for us to talk together. But the presentation that I put together before having visited this space. And now that I'm here, I'm just so excited to talk about all of the histories and stories that are in this building and in this wonderful community that you fostered. So I'm very happy to be here. I'll start off, I'm gonna speak to the work that we've been doing at the Muslims in Canada Archives, which is ostensibly the first institution of its kind in Canada dedicated to preserving stories of Muslim life across the country. And I also want to do a bit of a show and tell of different records and items in our collection that point to the many creative ways that Muslims in Canada have valued authorship and taken up self-representation, both as a practice to communicate with one another and also, of course, to define ourselves on our own terms. So I'll start with that overview of what MiCA is, and then I'll go into sharing some publications, especially from the 70s and 80s, because at that time, print publication was the main form of communicating with one another. And I have some publications as well that I'm going to lay out on that table that we can look at together. And then I'll close by doing a quick tutorial and walkthrough of our newly launched digital database. We have a database that includes hundreds of records of digitized Muslim stories. And we just launched it last month, so we're very excited to be able to share it with you. And when we look at that database, and just when we're talking throughout this, I want to note that we'll be looking and reflecting on what's there, but it will also be important to reflect on what's missing because we're a very new archive. There is a lot of stories that we need to get into that archive to be able to preserve them and to honor those legacies. So as some folks in the room may already know, MiCA is housed at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. But that being said, just because we're based in Toronto, our goal is to represent all of Canada and inshallah have offices in every province and territory. And much of the work that Islamic studies does is take into question the Orientalist gaze that Muslims are so oftentimes interpreted through. And of course, that gaze continues on to the present, and we see that in mainstream media being but one example of how that lives on. But at the Institute of Islamic Studies, we ask, what if we reversed the direction of the gaze? What if we looked through the lens of Islam and Muslims onto Canada's society, rather than the other way around? And this thinking comes from a study by Dr. Anwar Iman, who's at the Institute of Islamic Studies, and his work looked at the way that the treatment of Muslims can actually offer a litmus test for the robustness of a state's supposed democracy. So put simply, the treatment of Muslims tells us a lot about the places that we live and how power operates within them. And how better can we understand the treatment of Muslims and the experiences of Muslims than through our stuff, our photographs, our letters, our meeting minutes, and all of the other mundane, neat items that we have that document our lives. So the Muslims in Canada Archives was developed as a participatory archive, and it's uniquely designed to preserve, document, and share the history of Muslims across Canada. A few years ago at MiCA, my colleague Mosca Roque did an environmental scan of archives of Muslims in Canada. So she looked at institutions, big Canadian memory institutions like the Library in Canada Archives, to see how Muslims are represented in these institutions. And over again, she found that our stories were missing or just completely not there. So that was her experience. That's what she found in doing this environmental scan. And a lot of that also has to do with the way that records are described. So for those of you in the room who maybe use archives in your day-to-day work, you may know that if, let's say, a photograph of a Muslim family is in the archives, if it's not interpreted by that archivist as a Muslim family, if they don't have that cultural sensitivity to understand what they're looking at, then the description will fail us, and it'll fail the researcher that searches Muslim in that database and nothing comes up. And so a lot of the work that we do at MiCA is filling that gap, making sure that we are culturally sensitive, making sure that we are using description practices that center the person who donated their records to us, and that's why we're participatory and we try to be collaborative throughout that process. And yeah, so that's the work that we're doing right now. We are trusted by the community because we consult with the community, we follow professional standards, so myself and all of my colleagues are accredited archivists. We use universal standards to do this work. We nurture institutional relationships, and we also have the support of Heritage Canada, which inshallah will allow us to build into the future and stay sustainable, because there are a lot of resources needed to be able to do this work properly. In terms of the types of materials we collect, we say it's basically anything and everything you have in your basement, under your bed, in your attic, postcards, letters, magazines, flyers, shopping lists. We have menus from restaurants in our collection. We have, trying to think of the most obscure thing in our collection, maps, lots of different certificates, awards, arts and crafts projects. All of that tells us a story of Muslim life, and all of that we're looking to be able to preserve. And in terms of who uses our materials, we've been working with students, especially at the University of Toronto because that's where we're based, but students of all ages we're hoping to be able to engage with. Educators, artists and curators. This is actually an exhibit that we have up right now at Macintosh Gallery at Western University in London, Ontario. And it pulls from all of these records of Muslim history in London, paired alongside artworks from artists in London, Muslim artists in London. Researchers, this is Dr. Aaron Hughes, who is using our resources to write his forthcoming book. And yeah, I think there were a couple others, just community members. So now I'm going to shift gears, and hopefully not take too much time, but I did want to speak briefly to some of the print publications that we have in our collection. And so we have, oh, and actually I wanted to mention something, a personal note about myself as we do this. I actually, my father, growing up, was publishing a Farsi publication that was circulated in grocery stores and masjids and community centers the way that we still see they are. But I know for a fact that the publication that he produced doesn't live beyond our basement. Like, it hasn't been preserved. So that's why I have a very personal investment in making sure that we can do better for all of the work that we're doing in preserving those legacies. So in our collection, we do have a lot of different magazines and newspapers, and they offer this glimpse into everyday Muslim life. In many instances, for new migrant communities, we see that these are really essential ways for people to learn about one another and foster connectivity with other Muslims in the country. And the magazines in this image were produced by the Council of Muslim Communities of Canada, and their first edition came out in 1972. Some of these publications had limited resources, but some of them actually had a really far reach. So this is the Mac Minaret, which was a publication of students, the MSA, the Muslim Students Association at McMaster University. And even though they were based at McMaster University, they were publishing 5,000 copies, which means that they very likely were connecting with the Muslim community of Southern Ontario beyond the university. And this is an image from The Message, which circulated 20,000 copies across North America. And its Canadian edition was distributed in Calgary, Edmonton, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, as well as remote communities where Muslim people were living. And this tells us the value that was placed on print as a medium to do a lot of community work, which is not surprising, but again, it signals to how much of Muslim life we're able to better understand when we acquire and preserve and share these types of records. And what we also can see is the willingness of a lot of community members to not shy away from conversations that weren't happening in the Canadian mainstream. So this is from an edition of the Muslim Tribune ahead of a Canadian election, and it's a list of questions, and it's hard to see, so I kind of zoomed in to some main questions that this writer had for these political candidates. So very bold questions that hold a lot of relevance today. So questions like, will your party put an end to the discriminatory practice of restricting family reunification from Afghanistan and Somalia? Will your party commit to the funding of nonprofit co-op housing for community groups? Will your party, general questions about making life in Canada more healthy for families? So just a lot of interesting takeaways. And this is also one of my favorite items in our collection. It's a bulletin produced by the Canadian Society of Muslims called Eclipse of the Sun, Bigotry Obscures Objectivity. And essentially this entire bulletin, which I brought with me so we can look through it together, but the entire bulletin is a direct response to all of these Toronto Sun articles that are spreading hate speech about Muslims. And like point by point, it'll put the Toronto Sun article on one side and then have their kind of like counter argument on the other side. And it shows that Muslims are very clearly attuning to a lot of the misrepresentation happening and also rewriting that story. I just wanted to also do a small shout out that it wasn't just print that people were using to communicate with one another. And this is a radio station that Muslim women students at Ottawa had going on in the early 2000s. So now I'm gonna shift gears and talk about our website. We just launched it last month, and as you can see, we have this database here with a search bar and then also search options on the side. And there might be more or less than 390 right now, but we're constantly updating it. So a lot of the collection that we have been acquiring for the past few years is now completely digitized and available to the public 24/7. And we're really hoping that young learners, researchers, educators, and everyone in between can use this as a research tool and also just kind of take advantage of having this primary source, having first-hand access to a primary source. So I'd love to talk more about if there's anything on the website that folks in the room want to see, but I'd also love to just end in a moment and talk about what materials you have and what you want to see in our collection. We're on social media, and I'll wrap there, but we'd love to continue connecting with everyone in the room. And I see a question already.
No question.
Okay.
Information. What's the website?
Oh, the website is muslimsincanadaarchives.ca. I brought a lot of materials that I'll place on the table, including like a sign-up sheet for our newsletter and some forms for anyone who's thinking about records that they might have that they want to collect. We can fill them out together, talk about them together, and I have some pamphlets as well with our website.